One of the great things about tabletop games is the sense of space and place they create. There's a kind of immersion you get from seeing detailed miniatures instead of abstract tokens or game pieces. But for a lot of us, that's where the immersion stops, which is why I enjoy making terrain so much. Today we're going to start at the beginning and make one of the most impactful pieces of terrain you can have if you're just starting out, a basic desert mat. We're also going to address the age-old question of who the hell has a 6-foot by 4-foot table? The standard size for a Warhammer table is 6 feet by 4 feet, though some editions of the game suggested going with an 8-foot by 4-foot table, just in case. Fortunately, Gorkamorka, which is the main game I play, is pretty flexible when it comes to those sorts of details, as long as you have a table that's roughly rectangular. But 6x4 is still a good size, especially for roll and road scenarios, or scenarios with more than 2 players. So that's the size of mat I'm going to make. To make my 6-foot by 4-foot desert mat, I'm more or less following the method perfected by Eric's Hobby Workshop and other creators, taking a poly-backed canvas drop cloth and covering it with a mixture of caulk, sand, and paint. It's worth noting that much like 2x4 lumber, the size of these drop cloths is measured at some point before the edges are finished, so the finished cloth, frustratingly, is slightly smaller than the listed size. So be sure to get one that's bigger than the mat you're making. My drop cloth was actually 6 feet along one axis, which made things easy. I measured out 4 feet along the other direction, but also left a bit extra so I could finish that edge to match the other 3. And there we go. Perfectly sized bit of cloth to make our mat. To texture the mat, we need sand, paint, and acrylic caulk. You also need a paint tray to mix the stuff in, and a caulking gun to get the caulk out of the tube. I started off with 4 tubes, which was quite a bit for this paint tray. I started adding sand to the caulk a little bit at a time and mixing it in as I went. The caulk feels like weird rubbery frosting, so it never really feels mixed, so you just kind of have to mix until there's not a big pile of loose sand shifting around in the tray. I did make an attempt to carefully measure everything as I poured it in, but this pretty much only worked the first time before the plastic cup was coated in paint. In general, the mix I came up with for my texture paste was 4 tubes of caulk, 1 cup of sand, and half a cup each of yellow and brown craft paint. Once the texture paste was mixed, it was time to spread it on the drop cloth. I only tuned it down on the corners, since I wanted the texture paste to fill the full 6-foot by 4-foot area. It mostly worked, though the tape did come loose and let the mat bunch up when I tried to spread it evenly. Since it was incredibly thick, I was able to spread the paste right up to the very edge of the cloth without getting on my driveway, which was nice. I tried to spread the paste on as thin as I could while not allowing any of the canvas fabric to show through. I ended up using aquarium sand, not because it's better, but because I started this project in the middle of the pandemic lockdowns, and it was easy to have aquarium sand shipped to my house. Having a relatively fine sand was handy though, as it allowed me to spread it on pretty thin without any big grains of sand coming loose. This first batch of paste managed to cover about 2/3 of the mat. though it was getting spread pretty thin by the end, which meant it was time to mix some more paste. I mostly followed the same recipe as before, although this time I added a few drops of white paint to make the batch slightly lighter. That way, I could both use this to finish the last third of the mat, and added in a few other areas to add some slight variation in color. I taped the mat down a bit more thoroughly this time, in hopes of keeping the tape from coming loose. Then it was back to spreading. I made a bit too much considering how little of the mat I had left to go, but it gave me plenty for patching holes where you could see the texture of the canvas and generally blending colors together across the whole mat. You can kind of see these thin spots in the middle of the mat from a distance. I also found that while the little plastic putty knife was handy for scooping the paste onto the mat, it was actually a bit easier most of the time to just spread it around with my hands. Though you definitely wanted gloves for this. It was also getting late by this point, so my garage lights would flash on every time I stood up and moved around. The next day, once the mat had had time to dry, it was time to dry brush. At this point, I was mostly just eyeballing ratios, but I aimed for something around 1 part white to 2 parts yellow to 2 parts brown. This was a dry brush, so I didn't want very much paint on my brush. So I got a huge house painting brush and a cardboard box to use as a palette and got to work. It was nice I didn't have to kneel down to do this part. Even after drying, the caulk was still nice and flexible. And the whole thing could roll up, which meant that the mat was done. Almost. I didn't like the fact that even though the texture covered the entire top surface, you could still see white fabric right along the edge, so I decided to paint the edges with a dark brown ink. But I was too lazy to go find one, so I just used the wood stain that I bought for the table. The canvas absorbed the stain really well, though it dried much lighter than it went on, so the texture ended up with just a slight shade around the edges. As previously mentioned, you need a pretty big table to play Warhammer. As the 3rd edition 40k rulebook notes, most real wargamers will eventually want to build their own tables. So as a fake wargamer, I was off the hook. Usually when I was playing Warhammer, I was playing with Cygnus and his brothers, who had some proper tables built out of plywood, textured with sand, and painted classic 90s green. Though we would eventually paint these to be desert themed too. And they were pretty heavy to move about. But now I had a 6 foot by 4 foot mat of my own, and the biggest IKEA table I own only extends to a maximum size of about 3 feet by 5.5 feet. To deal with this problem, I decided to build a foldable tabletop that I could put on top of my existing table. It would need to be hinged in 2 places, it would need to lay flat, and it would need to be smooth so as to not scratch up the table below it. It would also be nice for it to be durable enough to throw in the back of a car and have drinks spilled on it or whatever without falling apart. I started with 3 pieces of 2 foot by 4 foot MDF that would form the tabletop. I measured an inch-wide strip along 4 sides where I would put the mortise for the hinges, noting that for the middle piece, one hinge would have to be on the top while the other was on the bottom. I didn't have a proper router, so I just bought a little router attachment for my Dremel. This worked okay at first, but pretty soon the depth stop kept coming loose and the bit would get stuck or break or make a weird cut. I probably should have just bought a normal router from the start, but I decided to just use a hammer and chisel. Wood chisels aren't really designed for use on medium density fiberboard, so it was a bit odd to work with. The chisel didn't so much shave off slices of wood as it did just separate the layers of paper, but I managed to get the job done. After hacking the boards to pieces, I gave the mortise a good sanding to even it out as much as I could. Then I gave all 3 boards a dark stain to make them look a bit less like MDF. And spray the painted edges brown because I couldn't be bothered to paint stain on them. Since the table had to fold flat and lie flat on both sides, I couldn't use a normal metal hinge. Instead, I bought some heavy-duty nylon webbing of the kind used in seatbelts. I cut the straps to size and melted the frayed edges. The streaks that look like wood green were not intentional. I noticed while staining the boards that my brush strokes kind of looked like wood green, so I started doing it that way on purpose. I didn't realize that once the stain dried, the streaks would become visible again. Oops. I wanted to make sure that the hinges were as securely attached to the boards as possible, so the first step was putting down some glue. I then stapled the straps to the board while the glue was still fresh. Turns out that glue expands quite a bit as it cured, so I probably could have used quite a bit less. But either way, my improvised hinge seemed to work pretty well, which meant it was time to do the other side, so I repeated the process again. But this time I use less glue, which I recommend because cleaning up glue is not fun. Cleaning up the glue was only moderately effective and screwed up the finish on the ends, so I decided to just spray paint everything black and call it good. So now the tabletop was mostly finished and in a usable state. The only thing it needed was to have a varnish to protect it and make its surface smoother. As those who follow this channel might have noticed, I frequently get interrupted for weeks or months in the middle of a project, and this one was no exception, which is fine. The only thing you have to remember on a project that's not finished is to store it properly, so you don't have to sand off years worth of spiderwebs or something. Wait, no. Just a second. Just a second. I'm watching long, glassy, blind looking smart crab. Okay, moving on. Before I varnished the table, I decided to stencil on my logo. It sort of worked. My next step was to paint on some clear lacquer. This stuff has crazy fumes, so use an appropriate respirator and get as much ventilation as you can. Ideally, you want to paint the lacquer on in long, smooth strokes. I didn't do great at that. Once the first coat had dried, it was time for my second coat. Yeah, after this point it gets pretty hard to see anything I'm doing here on film. Once those 2 coats had dried, I flipped it over and started on the other side. Oh yeah, I did much better with the long strokes on this side. Then once that coat was dried, it was time for a second coat. I won't make you watch it, but I ended up doing 4 coats of lacquer on each side. Once all the coats were finished, I sanded it with some 1500 grit sandpaper and soapy water. I then buffed on some wax. This step is 100% unnecessary for a stupid fold-up gaming table. But I've been watching a ton of woodworking videos at this point and thought, what the hell. The staples were already inset into the table, but just to make absolutely sure that this thing couldn't scratch up whatever was underneath it, I decided to cover up the hinges in black felt. I attached the felt with hot glue, so I suppose if it rips or wears out, it'll be relatively easy to replace later. And same thing on the other hinge on the opposite side. And with that, my foldable tabletop was complete. Since portability was the whole point of making the tabletop and mat instead of a whole gaming table, I needed to make it easier to put away. I decided to get some elastic band to make some straps. Yay! For the table, I just bought some straps off Amazon, which was way easier. Yay! To help me roll up the mat and store it in a way that wouldn't get folded and cracked, I decided to wrap it around a pool noodle. I put a spare piece of PVC pipe inside to give it a bit more rigidity, though I might eventually buy a wooden dowel to replace that. And with my custom straps on the end, the mat is ready to go. The ties for the table also get the job done. And at long last, my portable wargaming table is complete. After being used multiple times and stored for a year, the acrylic caulk holds up pretty well. It's definitely got some waves and bumps, as well as a few decent sized cracks, but it's still flexible and hasn't flaked off. I'll have to experiment with a few more of these at some point, because I severely overestimated the amount of caulk I'd need for this project. So now I've got caulk for days. Now if you'll excuse me, it's the beginning of Orktober, which means I'm going to really have to get moving if I hope to get my next project done in just 13 months for Orktober 2025.